firm purchases of 400 megawatts and non-firm purchases of 250 megawatts from a marketer and PJM curtailed. I want to make the point here on the non-firm purchase. The non-firm purchases were made after we saw the load outpacing forecast, and we knew it was going to be tight across the peak. We were using that non-firm energy to build margin as we looked ahead towards the operation across the peak. As the morning continued, a third-party independent power producer in our balancing authority lost approximately 350 megawatts of supply. Some of our network customers, our wholesale customers, were also challenged with meeting their load generation balance. By this point in time, we'd lost approximately 1,300 megawatts of generation supply in the morning ramp up towards the peak. At this point in time, we had called on our demand side management and demand response, which we believe bought us about 200 megawatts of load reduction per the GLRP, the General Load Reduction Plan. And by 6 a.m., our area control error, and we've talked about that in prior testimony, that is, the acronym is ACE, was negative, and it was continuing negative. It was increasing in more negativity. So ACE, as we've discussed before, is the mechanism by which a balancing authority determines its generation and load balance plus our frequency support obligation to the Eastern Interconnection. To the interconnection you're in, for DEP and DEC, it's the Eastern Interconnection. A negative ACE in a period of time when interconnection frequency is below 60 hertz indicates that that balancing authority is negatively impacting the interconnection frequency. That is not a desired state. And so as we move forward in time by these prior events, we were out of generation to pick up. There was no purchase power available to us, and we had called on all our demand response that we could. Our ACE values went from minus 152 megawatts at 5 a.m. to minus 290 megawatts at 5:30 to minus 400 megawatts at 6:10 in the morning to minus 448 megawatts at 7 in the morning. And keep in mind, during this window of time, the load continues to increase. And it's moving forward, and it's increasing our ACE negativity. We utilize the emergency energy alert system that NERC has in place. We had declared EEA 1 prior to the start of the evening earlier on the 23rd. That means you are planning to use all of your generation resources to meet the peak. We moved to EEA level 2 at 4:10. That means you are preparing to use all demand side resources and demand response to meet your peak. And we entered EEA 3 at 6:05, which means that load shed is imminent or in progress. That goes to all RCs, reliability coordinators in NERC. It's a quick way to alert your neighbors, the other RCs, of your condition. Interconnection frequency was moving below 60 hertz, and DEC, Duke Energy Carolinas, was contributing to that negativity through our negative ACE. These conditions, along with load continuing to increase, drove the decision that the ECC would trigger a load shed event at approximately 6:14 that morning. We peaked at hour ending 0700 at 20,882 megawatt hours. That was affected by approximately 1,000 megawatts of load shed requested up to that point. We crossed zero ACE, area control error, which means you're in balance. And it's just not load and generation. It's also our interconnection frequency obligation to support frequency. Every BA has it. We crossed zero at approximately 8:47 a.m. At this point in time, we still had customers in the load shed mode, and we started restoring customers, working with our distribution control center teammates at approximately 9:03 that morning, the 24th. We came out of our NERC energy emergency alert status when load shed customers were restored, and that was approximately 4 p.m. on the 24th. I'll now move on to Duke Energy progress. And what you'll hear is a similar story, not exact, but a similar story with a shift in time. At 6 p.m. on the 23rd, we were projecting to meet our customer load demand with more than 1,100 megawatts of operating reserves. And just like we discussed in DEC, that means we can meet our load, our obligation to our customers, and cover the loss of the largest unit in DEP, Duke Energy Progress, which is approximately 1,000 megawatts, and have additional operating reserves to cover the uncertainties that can and do crop up in real-time operations. At 2 a.m., we were still projecting over 1,000 megawatts of operating reserves across peak. The load was continuing to increase, and our forecast was tracking that. Between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., the following events occurred that depleted our operating reserves in Duke Energy Progress. Our Roxboro 3 unit was derated by approximately 325 megawatts. As I stated a minute ago, actual load continued, and DEP started to outpace our forecasted load. Mayo 1 was derated by approximately 350 megawatts. We lost approximately 500 megawatts of firm purchases from a marketer in PJM. A DEP network customer lost a 305 megawatt purchase. We lost 175 megawatts from the Broad River generation facility outside of the DEP balancing authority. If you total all that up, that's approximately a loss in that morning run up to peak of over 1,500 megawatts. By 6:20 in DEP, we had no more generation to bring on.
Mr. Holman, how much was lost from Broad River? I'm sorry, I missed that.
How much? It was 175 megawatts.
Thank you.
And Broad River is an independent power producer outside of the DEP balancing authority. At this point in time, at 6:20, we had no more generation to bring on. We had no more demand response to call for, and we had no more energy that we could purchase in the market. Our area control area, just like in DEC, was negative and growing more negative. At 5 a.m., it was minus 52. At 6 a.m., it was minus 318. By 6:18 a.m., it was minus 940 megawatts. And by 6:25, it was 638. We had entered EEA 1, same criteria as I described in DEC, at 0537. We entered EEA 2 at 606. We entered EEA 3 at 634. And you'll notice that the response and the load move, the advancement of the load was later in DEP than it was DEC. Just like in DEC, interconnection frequency is the same for both of these balancing authority. It was moving below 60 hertz and dropping. These conditions, along with the rising load that we were continuing to experience, triggered a load shed event at 0625. We peaked at hour ending 0600 in DEP at 14,122 megawatt hours. This was affected by approximately 911 megawatts of load shed requested up to that point. We crossed zero ACE, which means we were in balance in terms of our load and generation and our frequency support obligation at 8 that morning. At this time, we still had customers in load shed mode. We started the customer restoration process in DEP at approximately 8:12 that morning. We came out of our NERC energy emergency alert status when all load shed customers were restored at approximately 4:24 in the afternoon on the 24th. As you can see from the timeline, events in the morning run up leading up to the peaking hours in both DEC and DEP happened very quickly. Given the conditions we faced, our system operators in both of our ECCs, in DEP and DEC, made the correct decision to implement rotating load shed. The decision to shed firm load in a controlled manner was based on the fact that both DEC and DEP balancing authorities were negatively impacting the Eastern Interconnections frequency, the bulk electric system for DEP and DEC. The Eastern Interconnection frequency was below 60 and trending further below 60. The balancing authorities negatively affecting frequency, and we weren't the only ones. There were others that were struggling during this same period of time. If they don't take steps to balance their load and frequency obligation, the bulk electric system, in our case here, the Eastern Interconnection, is at risk for under-frequency load shedding, which reduces large chunks of load across a very wide area. If under-frequency load shedding does not work, the stability of the bulk electric system, the Eastern Interconnection, is at risk. And that risk comes in the form of uncontrolled loss of the system. The Northeast blackout of 2003 was driven by different factors on the front end, but the outcome, uncontrolled loss of the system, allowing the physics to solve the problem, was what we were defending against in DEP and DEC when we made the decision to shed load. Our operators, system operators in the ECCs and our operators in the distribution control centers were faced with very difficult operating conditions and very difficult decisions. We understand the gravity and the significance of these decisions had on our customers. Many of our operators in both offices, homes, and families were impacted by these decisions. We will learn from this event. We will strive to lower the probability that this type of event happens again. But if we have similar conditions and similar operating environments in the future, our operators will take the same actions. It's their obligation to the interconnection. It's every system operator and every balancing authority in the Eastern interconnection's obligation to the broader interconnection, in our case, the Eastern interconnection. At this point in time, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Preston Gillespie, who will take us through our generation preparation and answer questions about our generation capabilities throughout this event. Thank you.
So thank you, Sam, and good morning. I'll provide a view of our actions prior to, during, and subsequent to the cold weather event, starting with prior to the cold front arriving within our service territories. Our operational protocols recognize the importance of rigorous preparation to maximize our plant's reliability during extreme weather events. And we've improved the fleet's cold weather resiliency through programmatic activities that maximize protection against extreme low temperatures. Some of these actions include optimizing plant heating equipment performance, ensuring our heat trace circuits are ready for operation when called upon. Heat trace circuits are how we deliver energy to piping to keep the piping warm during periods of cold weather. We identify areas that require installation of structures such as windbreaks to shield the equipment from cold weather. We validate the piping insulation's integrity. We perform detailed walkdowns to monitor equipment performance and identify and correct any deficiencies as they are found. We assess our cold weather program requirements against industry best practices and our own internal operating experience. And since Winter Storm Uri in 2021, we've placed additional focus on our dual fuel units, reliability, and ensuring adequate supplies of fuel oil are always available such that we improve fuel diversity. On December 16, with the impending cold weather approaching, we confirmed that all of our operating facilities had completed their cold weather preparation actions. And additionally, we were working closely with Sam's team to monitor the weather forecast and ensure available generation resources were sufficient to meet the forecast demand. On 22 December, approximately 89% of our total generation capacity of approximately 36,000 megawatts was available. 93% of our total nuclear generation capacity was available, and the nuclear capacity is approximately 11,000 megawatts, and approximately 88% of our non-nuclear generation capacity of approximately 25,000 megawatts was also in service. These values represent both the combined DEP and DEC jurisdictions' capacity. Put this in context, 10 of our 11 nuclear units were in service, 11 of our 15 coal-fired units were in service, 8 of our 9 combined cycle plants were in service, and all 55 simple cycle combustion turbine units were available for service. So upon the arrival of the cold front, as Sam touched upon, we experienced a reduction of generation of approximately 3.6%, or around 1,308 megawatts from midnight through early Saturday morning. If I look at where the reduction of generation occurred, I'll start with the nuclear fleet. Our operating nuclear units were reliable throughout the weather event, producing approximately 10,300 megawatts for both the DEC and DEP systems. The operational issues causing the generation reduction were weather-related. Overall, our cold weather protective measures performed well. However, in a few cases, insulation and heat tracing did not prevent instrumentation lines from freezing, which precipitated a reduction in generation. And as we worked to return our instrumentation to service, we had to address a few other mechanical issues occurring as a result of the plant system's responses. And this is not unusual when a plant moves from a condition of steady state operation to a new point of operation. Sam noted, and I'll just emphasize here again, that throughout the weather event, we did not experience any unit trips. We did experience unit derates. Our generation reductions were all restored on 25 December. And while fuel supplies and inventories played no role in the generation reduction, I will note we took a few minor operational actions to address low gas pressure on the gas pipeline. Solar generation performed as expected, but was not available to meet the peak demand since the peak occurred prior to sunrise. So looking forward, our cold weather preparation program has had a positive impact on plant reliability. For example, during the 2014 polar vortex, our coal and gas units saw a reduced generation of approximately 3,600 megawatts due to outages and derates. But still, the amount of energy we delivered through this weather event, or the amount of energy the amount of generation reduction during this weather event was not zero. So we are evaluating our plant's performance, and we're working to identify the lessons learned to position the generation fleet for even better performance in the future. Before I turn over to Scott, I would like to take an opportunity to recognize our operators, our maintenance craftsmen, and our engineers who responded immediately and worked throughout the period to minimize the impact that this was having on our customers. Now I'll turn it over to Scott Batson to talk through the events that occurred during the restoration activities of 24 December.
Mr. Gillespie, before we hear from Mr. Batson, I do want to ask you a specific question. You indicated that weather impacted several of your generating units, and you gave an example of precipitation lines freezing. I think that's what I heard you say.
Instrumentation lines.
Okay. Is that the case at each of the, based on what you all have provided today, it looks like Dan River was derated, and then Roxborough and Mayo were also derated. So that's what occurred at each of those three stations?
Each one started off with instrumentation lines that froze.
Okay.
And that prompted a plant reaction, basically to move from full power to approximately half its power capacity. And so once we got the instrumentation lines fixed, there were other repairs we had to do. At Dan River, we had a valve that we had to replace limit switches on because the valve had changed position. And it was coincidental to the event. But again, if you look at when a plant moves from one operational point to another, there are things that our maintenance craftsmen have to go out and address.
Okay. Understood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Preston. And I will go through and provide an overview of the actions associated with our load shed implementation on December 24th and the associated recovery. I will say that these actions were implemented per the general load shed and system restoration plan for DEC and DEP. I will speak to a sequence of events, but I'd ask that you recognize that these activities were taking place separately in DEC and DEP. So the times that I give will be general as I talk about them as one set of actions. At 6:20 a.m., the initial load shed request from the Energy Control Center was to reduce load in DEC by 400 megawatts and to reduce load in DEP by 600 megawatts. At 6:30 a.m., the initial load shed, at 6:30 a.m., the requested load shed reductions were initiated using our automated rotational load shed tool. This tool allows the operators to go in and set a megawatt reduction for the system, along with the outage duration for the circuits that are taken offline. Then it rotates through a set of prioritized circuits to maintain that set load reduction, but to minimize the duration of the outages on individual circuits. The priority list that we start off with is a list that avoids circuits that feed critical infrastructure, emergency facilities, hospitals, nursing facilities, and those type of things. At 6:45, the automated tool worked properly for a 400 megawatt reduction in DEC. And this resulted in cycling through 15-minute outages for that 400 megawatt reduction. There was a total of 234 circuits that were actually removed from service by the tool and restored to service by the tool for outage durations of approximately 15 minutes. At 7 a.m., the automated tool also worked properly to achieve the initial 600 megawatt reduction, but then stopped responding when it attempted to begin the cycling process of that initial 600 megawatt reduction for DEP. At 7:05, during the initial load reduction for DEC and DEP, a second request to reduce load in DEC by an additional 600 megawatts and to reduce load in DEP by additional 200 megawatts was issued. At 7:10 a.m., the automated tool did not respond to these additional load reduction commands, requiring the operators to begin executing the required activities for managing load manually. At 7:35 a.m., to maintain the integrity of the grid, and the Energy Control Center progressed to actually trip 2 transmission lines to achieve the required reduction. At 8 a.m., the operators successfully completed the required manual load reductions with a total of 269 circuits being out of service, and then turned their attention to the restoration activities that would be required for those circuits. I will note that during this time, some of the automatic rotation of circuits was continuing from that initial 400 megawatt reduction in DEC. Between 8 a.m. and 9:30 a.m., the operators assessed the system conditions, prepared for manual restorations, and received notification to begin restoration. There were a couple of things that the operators were working through during this time. There is a condition called cold load pickup that occurs when circuits are out of service for a period of time, especially during extreme weather conditions. When the operators are faced with a cold load pickup situation, they have to monitor the system very closely and basically sequence the restoration by sectionalizing the circuits and breaking them down into smaller segments to do restoration. Under cold load pickup, the actual load on the system can be 6 to 8 times what it normally is for a normal weather day and under normal conditions. So most of the circuits that we had to do restoration on, 269 circuits, required us to sectionalize those circuits and do step restoration. So as the operators work through that, I will note that the benefits that we have done to our grid have been very beneficial. This benefits to the upgrades to our grid that we have made allowed us to sectionalize and provided automation that could be handled from the DCCs rather than dispatching technicians out to the field to actually do the sectionalization. Another dynamic the operators were dealing with for this particular event was the wind event that occurred on December 23rd. At the end of the day on December 23rd, we had about 36,000 customers that were still out due to damage associated with the wind event. We'd restored the majority of the customers, but we still had those outstanding. So when we went into the load shed event, some of the circuits that were impacted by the load shed were also circuits that had customers out associated with the wind event. Because we had to move to manual operation, the operators had to go in and make sure that they identified those circuits that were out of service associated with the wind event before they began restoration from the load shed to ensure that we did not re-energize any damaged circuits that had damage to them that could jeopardize the safety of the public, our customers, or our employees as they were continuing to do restoration. I'll share that all of the 269 circuits were restored manually between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. This equates to a rate of about 34 circuits per hour. So it's a tremendous amount of work completed by the operators in the DCCs as they went through and did those restorations. We do deeply regret that some of our customers were without power for an extended amount of time on Christmas Eve. But given the challenging situations our operators faced, they took the proper actions without any human performance errors that have been notified that we've identified to date. I'm very proud of how our transmissions and delivery grid operations teams perform under these extreme conditions. I do want to speak to a minute about the rotational load shed tool and the problems that we encountered there. Immediately following the problem with the tool, we engaged our IT organization as well as the supplier of the tool to begin diagnosing what caused the problem. They worked with us throughout the day on Christmas Eve as well as Christmas Day and over this past week. And we continued the investigation into what drove the failure of the tool to perform as we expected it to. What I can tell you at this point, we began using the tool in 2017. We've tested the tool annually on numerous occasions since that time. The latest test that we performed on the tool was on December 12th of 2022. We also use this tool in our tabletop exercises, so our operators are familiar with it and they go through annual training on the tool. We'll continue our investigation on the tool. We'll make sure that we correct the issues associated with it, and it will go through rigorous testing before we return it to service. Last, I would share that while we don't have a plan to be in this situation again, we don't ever plan to be in this situation again in terms of actually having to do a load reduction. We've taken the lessons learned, we've briefed our operators, they fully understand what would be involved in a manual load shed reduction, and that is the mechanism we would use until we can get the tool back in service if we were faced with the event again. If I may, I will go ahead. I am also going to cover the customer communications and the activities that took place there. While I won't use a specific timeline as I shared during the load shed activities, it's important to note that we were updating customers as new information was available. Our communication actions did follow our grid load reduction communication plan, but due to the rapid evolvement of this event, we did enter the communication plan after the load shed had started, but we still completed the actions associated with it. Immediately following the initiation of load reductions, we initiated our communications to our customers and stakeholders. We used mass communication channels to update our customers since this was the most expedient means of communicating during this rapidly developing event. Mass channels include social media, traditional media, website, and mobile app updates. In quick succession, we added an alert banner to our customer outage map. We posted messages on Facebook and Twitter. We distributed news releases. We had a team of communicators that were conducting media interviews to answer questions. We updated our interactive voice response system, the IVR system, and we placed alert banners up on our main website and mobile site. While we did not distribute direct messages directly to customers, the basis for this was in order to send a specialized message to customers in conditions like this, we actually have to go in and develop that message. We have to send it out to the customers using the channels that we have and the suppliers that actually send those messages out. The duration of that type of communication takes several hours for us to actually be able to get the message to those that deliver the messages through text messages, through the different carriers, and then actually get it sent out. So it can take several hours to do that. So we focus more on the mass media. Our initial messages did communicate to our customers that outages would last for 15 to 30 minutes. So that information was inaccurate for some customers. Again, some rotational outages did occur and those times were accurate. When we received information about the issues associated with the automated tool, we did change the messaging to reflect a 30 to 60-minute restoration time. Then when we determined that the remaining load reductions would be required to be performed manually and all restoration would be required to be performed manually, we changed the messaging to say that we would have the customers affected by the load shed event restored by the end of the day. In late afternoon and early evening, we initiated our communications that were requesting that our customers conserve energy on the morning of Christmas morning and on the morning of December 26th. There was good response from our customers, and they did assist us in managing the load as we went into those 2 mornings. As a result of the rotating outages that we had on Christmas Eve, we have gone in and actually developed automated messages that we will use as part of our direct-to-customer messaging going forward. If we were to find ourselves in this event again, we do have automatic messages that would then be sent out to our customers in the event we found ourselves in a rapidly evolving load shed event. With that, I would like to now turn it back over to Kendall Bowman to talk about our next steps.
Ms. Bowman, before we get to you, just one question quickly for you to help me sort of get oriented on this timeline. At what point did you all change at what time did you change the message going to customers explaining that restoration would occur by the end of the day?
That was around noon to early afternoon.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ms. Bowman.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Going forward, we're looking into every opportunity to learn from this situation. We will learn more and better understand our system's evolving load profile, particularly in severe cold weather situations. We'll also evaluate our criteria for when we communicate to customers. Again, particularly in winter events, when strain on the system can occur quickly and often in the overnight hours. We will fully engage with the FERC-NERC joint inquiry that Sam mentioned, and take every opportunity to improve our system. On behalf of Duke Energy, I want to thank you, the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to walk through the events of December 24th. We are incredibly sorry that some of our customers experienced power outages over the holidays. I know I speak for myself and my teammates when I say that we strive every day to be better than we were yesterday. And we're committed to developing a much better understanding of these events and what we can do to avoid rolling service disruptions and improve communications in the future. And with that, we'll open it up to whatever questions you may have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Bowman, and thanks to all of you for being here this morning and for updating us with the information that you have so far. I'll just say a few things. I have some questions for you all, and I'm certain my colleagues have some questions for you all as well. First, just one clarification for me. Ms. Bowman, I think you referenced 300 outages as a result of the windstorm that occurred on Friday night. Did I get that number right?
300,000.
That's what I'm sorry,
Yeah.
300,000,
Yes.
right? And that was across the 2 BAs?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and my understanding from what you all have said today is that you had all those customers restored by Christmas Eve? Or was it by the end of the day, Christmas Eve?
I think it was,
We did, for the load shed customers,
No, for the customers affected by the storm.
the wind.
all of those customers were restored on Christmas Eve
By
as
Christmas
well
Eve.
as the load shed
Okay.
customers.
Okay. All right, and Mr. Batson, you got to the next question, which was, and the load shed customers were also restored by end of day on Christmas Eve?
That is
Okay.
correct.
Okay. Again, thank you all for this explanation. This helps us better understand what happened. I want to express appreciation for your technicians and your people who were on the front line dealing with these changes as they were occurring rapidly and doing their best to address the challenge. Your description of the events the night of the 23rd and in the wee hours of the 24th are concerning and scary, especially as we hear that that the BAs were negatively affecting the Eastern interconnection. So I want to express again appreciation for the work that you all did to mitigate any impact to the EI. Also want to say we need to understand what happened here so that we can protect against this going forward. So with that, I have a few questions that I'd like to ask. I'm just going to, you all, any of you, all of you, answer them as appropriate. You've done a good job into sort of whittling away my list with your remarks this morning, but help me understand when you all were able to move out of EEA3 status. I just want to make sure I have that timing correct. As I understand it, it was around 4 o'clock on the 24th in both BAs, but is my understanding correct?
Yeah, Chairman Mitchell, I can help you with that. So, thank you. Thank you, Kendall. So we moved out of EEA 3 in, let me get this right for you. We moved out of NERC Energy Emergency Alert Status 3 when all our load shed customers were restored in DEC around 4 p.m. And then in DEP, following the same logic, we moved out of EEA level 3 status when all load shed customers were restored around 4:24 p.m.
Okay, and that's on December 24th
That's
in both
Christmas
instances.
Eve.
Okay,
Yes,
just
that's
want to be clear there. Okay, and then how long did you all have to remain, did the BAs have to remain in EEA2?
As we managed the loads that day, transitioning from the 24th to the 25th, we remained in EEA level 2 and level 1 as we transitioned into those days. Now, we were working really hard, working with Preston's team to get as much generation as we could, Nelson's team to get all system purchases established, but we didn't feel it was prudent to move out of that given our condition.
Okay, so at what point, are the BAs out of the
Oh,
EEA?
they're out now.
Okay, and at what point were you able to lift that status?
I believe it was, subject to check, and we can validate this, it was sometimes Monday, the 26th.
The 26th, okay, okay. You all have mentioned several, so we talked some, Mr. Gillespie, we talked about the units that you mentioned that were derated as a result of cold weather, impact from cold weather. Then there are, you mentioned for DEC, there's a third-party firm purchase that tripped, resulting in a loss of 350 megawatts between 4 and 6. What can you tell us? What happened there? Can you?
We had a purchase supplier that
Yeah, I think that was probably me. I think to answer
Okay.
that. So we had, could you repeat your question?
So I'm looking at this is on your DEC timeline. There's a third party that provides firm purchase generation that tripped, resulting in a loss of 350 megawatts between 4 and 6 a.m.
That's in DEC.
DEC.
So that was a third party generator who tripped. We're not at this point in time sure as to what happened, but they were providing generation to load in both BAs.
Okay. And I assume that's a natural gas fire generating facility, or can you tell us anything about that facility?
I can't.
Okay.
I'm not sure what the fuel is. I think it is natural gas, but I'm not positive.
Okay. And then just to help me understand, help us up here understand, you indicate that there were 400 megawatts of firm purchase supply, and I assume that contract had been entered into prior to the company's understanding of the events of this time frame.
Mr. Taylor? Yeah. Day ahead. It was day ahead. As you look at the week starting on Monday, we were projecting to have ample operating reserve. There was no need to enter into any capacity purchases or firm purchases. As the operating reserve began to drop, we made the decision the 23rd to make those capacity purchases.
Okay, so you got you all purchased the 400 megawatts and then an additional 250 that was non-firm.
That was late in the day on the 23rd.
And neither of those were available to the company.
Across the peak, the non-firm never flowed. It was curtailed before it started.
Okay.
The firm purchases did flow for a while, but across the peak, they did not. Nelson, is that?
Do we know why not?
At this point in time, I'm not aware of the reason. Nelson may have.
Okay, Mr. Peeler.
Yeah, Chair Mitchell. So those were curtailed or cut out of PJM.
Okay.
They were coming out of the PJMBA.
Okay.
Chair Mitchell, PJM was in up to EEA2 status during this early morning on the 22nd, or excuse me, the 24th. And so they were following their emergency procedures just like we were.
Okay. All right, so then, Mr. Peeler, this one's probably for you too. On the DEP timeline, firm purchase of 500 megawatts was lost 6 o'clock in the morning, I assume, same situation?
It's the same situation,
Okay.
yes.
And then 305 megawatts from a DEP network customer, what can you tell us about that?
That's a network customer who had made that purchase, and it was cut for them, just like ours were cut. They informed us of it, and we worked with them to manage the effect on the load generation balance. That's a lost resources that directly impacts our ACE.
Understood. And so that's the same thing, that was a curtailment from PJM, I assume, or do we know where that purchase was coming from?
We believe that's correct.
Okay. Okay. How much, how much notice do you all have of the curtailment from PJM? Is it instantaneous? Do you have some advance warning? I mean, how do you know that a purchase isn't, that a curtailment's going to occur?
From an operational execution perspective, that comes through tools that tell us, hey, this schedule is going to be curtailed at this time on this ramp. And so it's not an out of the blue, suddenly it goes to zero, but it is within the operating horizon that early morning hour. We weren't expecting that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add, these were very quick. PJM was declaring emergency emergency levels, and the notification on these were very short.
Okay. All right, what can you all tell me about the situation on Transco during the 24th, really through the 26th?
I'll take that one.
Okay.
So during the entire event, we did not have any gas deliverability issues. All our gas was delivered and did not affect our generation in any way across the peak. We did have some pressure issues toward our Buck combined cycle plant on the morning of the 24th, but it was after the peak period was closer to the 10 a.m. time period. And that low pressure resulted in us derating that plant to keep it online. So we ran that plant at a lower output from around 10 a.m. The morning of the 24th, again, when we were past the need for load shed. And that pressure remained low into Buck through sometime on the 25th. But again, didn't really affect us across the peak. It did make a little bit of derate for those couple of days. And it also led us to run a few other units on oil on the 25th, just to make sure we didn't affect that pressure issue.
Okay, so which units did you have to convert to oil?
We ran around 20, I think it was 23 of our 55 units were ultimately ran on oil at some point or another.
And the 20, I assume that
I'll
those
get the
are
exact, approximately
combustion turbine
20
units?
combustion turbine units,
Yeah.
correct.
Okay. And was that done just proactively so that you didn't encounter problems there as
did.
you were observing the pressure issue on Transco?
We did.
Yeah, and oil was more economic than gas as well
Got it. Okay.
during a lot of the event.
Okay. And when did the pressure issue on Transco resolve?
It was on the 25th.
Okay. And I assume for those 23 units that y'all converted, that y'all switched to the fuel oil, no problems in making that switch?
Well, no significant problems. We had At one of our facilities, we did, we had one of our CTs that when it started on oil, did not run on oil. It had a clogged strainer. And so we basically split that facility in half and ran half on gas, half on oil. We had, at another one of our facilities, we had some electronics, a fuel control card that we had to deal with, but they were minor. We had a few minor issues operating on oil, but by and large, the units that we started on oil ran on oil and ran through the duration of the event on oil with no issue.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peeler, any transmission constraints that impeded the company's ability to move power or import power during this time?
There were no transmission load reliefs called, so nothing was because of the transmission constraints.
Okay. What can you tell me about Dominion's withdrawal from the VACAR reserve sharing arrangement that negatively impact the companies during this period of time?
We don't think it did. Dominion, over the last few years since they had joined PJM, that we function as the VACAR RSG at that point in time through Dominion, through PJM. I don't believe it had any material impact on our operations over the window of time.
So let me ask the question differently. I understand your response, but if Dominion had remained in the reserve sharing arrangement, would there have been electricity available to either of the VAs during this period of time?
So I think that's a question that we'll be able to look at once the FERC and NERC inquiry takes place, because that'll be a broader perspective. I don't know what Dominion's capacity energy situation was, given that they're a part of PJM, but I have no indications that it would have been marginally impactful to this situation for us. I mean, Nelson, I don't know if you.
No, I would agree with you, Sam. I think the data points we have are the emergency level that PJM went to, the fact that they cut firm schedules out of their BA, and the fact that they put out a notification to purchase emergency energy early in the morning. So indications are that the PJM didn't have energy to send out. So it's unlikely that there would have been any help there.
Okay. You've talked some about the third-party resources that were not available when you all anticipated that they would be. Is there anything else that we need to understand about either the firm purchases or the purchases that you all had entered into, or the units that you were expecting to show up that didn't?
No, ma'am, I don't think so.
Okay. You did mention Broad River. I think you said you dropped Broad River 175 megawatts at some point on the 24th. Did Broad River get back up?
It did later in the weekend.
So the 25th or the 26th?
25th, subject
Okay.
to check, it was 25th or 26th.
Okay. And do you know what happened to that unit, to those units?
Not yet. We do not know yet.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk about, Mr. Holman, I'm particularly interested in your response to this question. Compare the complications or the complexities from a system operations standpoint of the events of the 24th, or that maybe the 23rd leading up to the 24th through the weekend, to previous cold weather events that you all have experienced, 14, 15, 18.
So I think one of the biggest contributors, or I guess differences, is in past cold weather events, polar vortex, for example, the off-system firm purchases held. That they were not cut in the run-up to the event, and I think that's one of the big factors. And I think the tightness of the overall region around Hurricane Elliott was different. People just didn't have any, balancing authorities just did not have any available energy to move. Everybody was tight. All of our neighbors were tight. A TVA had come off load shed the day before. And so there was just no purchases to make. And as we've informed you, the purchases that we did make had been already curtailed. And I think that's different from my operating memory on the polar vortex in 2018. There were balancing authorities that had operating reserves they were willing to move to other parties. And this one, there just wasn't any.
Okay. The materials y'all provided today indicate for DEC that on the 23rd, this was the evening of the 23rd, forecast is indicating 1,500 megawatts of operating reserves in DEC, and about 1,000, I think it was, 1,100.
That was at 8 p.m. the 23rd, excuse me, 6 p.m.
6
the
p.m.
23rd.
And then you've got 1,100 in, you've got 1,100 in DEP, and then you've got the next couple of hours, you've got demand outpacing your forecast.
That's correct.
And then you've got some derates and other things happening as a result of the cold weather. But
That's correct.
so going into those conditions, I mean, we knew the weather was coming. Or 1,500 megawatts and 1,100 megawatts, is that a comfortable place to be?
So system operators are never comfortable. I mean, we don't want our operators to be wishful thinkers. We want them to be critical decision makers and actually pessimists. That's kind of the nature, the behavior we want out of our operators. So we were not comfortable. I mean, we were, especially as we got from 6 p.m. to 10 into midnight, we knew it was going to be challenging across the peak. And there wasn't going to be a lot of off-system help that we could call for.
Okay.
But
Um,
Sam, don't we usually count on the largest unit
Yes.
being, if you could say something about that?
Yeah, our reserves up to midnight, we felt like we had enough reserves to cover our largest unit. Up to 10 o'clock anyway.
On the 10 o'clock on the
23rd.
23rd. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Right.
So Chair Mitchell, can I just add, just for clarity?
Yes.
The 900 megawatts that we purchased, we would have purchased more if it were available going into that evening. That there was already limitations on purchases available. So if you're asking about, if you're kind of going there of, would we have gotten more? We would have purchased more, but of course, even what we purchased was curtailed.
Okay. Anticipating, look, okay. All right.
We would have purchased more for additional margin if it would have had
If
been
it were
available
available.
on the 23rd.
Okay. Mr. Peeler, while you're at the microphone, what can you tell me about the accuracy of the load forecast? I mean, why was there such a divergence?
So the load forecast, I know a number of folks have talked about that it's a regression model. So it bases a lot of its ability to forecast accurately on known history or, historical events and things like how load behaves on a weekday or a weekend or a holiday or different months of the year. And so the model in this case did not perform as well at predicting customer load behavior for the Saturday, which, a weekend and a holiday. Two accuracy components that I would call out for in our forecast. One's the weather itself. So the temperature, the dew point, the wind speeds, the cloud cover, all those factors. And in that case, some part of the inaccuracy was associated with the weather forecast. Our weather forecast was the day before was approximately 2 degrees off for the DEC footprint and approximately 1 degree off in DEP. There was no cloud cover. There were very high winds associated with, so a lot of wind chill impact. The second component is taking that weather forecast and then applying it to the customer loads. And so, a lot of work and discussion about this is going on, but, it appears that the load behavior, at these temperatures, wind speeds, and all these other conditions was the higher load, likely from electric heating, other things that were just had not been seen by this model quite as clearly in the past. And in DEC, at our peak, we probably were off by close to 10%. DEC close to 10%. DEP less than that, maybe 5 to 6%. Historically, we look for, more into 3% range. But we do typically have higher errors in extreme conditions.
So just, I want to make sure I understand. So you indicate that the load forecasting was off 5 to 6% in DEP and about 10% in DEC,
Roughly, yes.
and 3%,
We
a
typically
3% divergence is something the company
typically
can
is our
manage.
normal type of expectation is
Okay.
normally around 3%.
Okay.
Overall, right? Fair weather and extreme combined. Extreme usually is a little harder to predict. And we use models that are, we use industry provided models. We have three different services that we use so that we can get comparison. Leading industry models that are used by the majority of the utility industry. All of our peers and folks that we talked to have experienced very similar errors in this event from the models they've used. Our weather forecast was in line with the National Weather Service forecast. We actually model our weather forecast and the National Weather Service forecast through all three of the model providers that we subscribe to and compare. And all of them were very similar in this case to what they projected.
Okay, so what can you all tell me about, you indicated the load behavior had not been seen by this model before. What's happening?
So it was a very cold day in December, which is an unusual day with very high winds. And the holiday makes it more complicated because the model is trying to determine how the load will behave. So for example, what industrial or commercial loads are there on a Saturday, Christmas Eve. That's a challenge to predict without history at those levels of temperature. So that's where the model struggles somewhat. Now, the positive news is once the model has the data from this event, it performs very well. Our forecasts for the 25th and 26th were very, very close to our actual loads.
Okay. So if this had been, let's say this had not been holiday weekend, if this had been sort of earlier in the week, for example, would the divergence have been greater?
I think it would have been less.
Less, okay.
Yeah, it would there's less uncertainty in a weekday when businesses are open.
Okay. Okay. Um, okay. So, given that the model has learned from this experience, do you anticipate that we won't see any more divergence
So certainly
this winter?
the model's better for this winter, certainly with the data it's provided, but we will continue to work with the vendor and as well have some internal discussion about how we can better understand and account for uncertainty, right? So when a model has uncertainty, how can we account for it better and prepare? So we're working on how we can improve that. But I would say certainly we expect the model to perform better now. It has already. Secondly, we need to take have some additional time to review what other actions we might take to deal with that uncertainty.
Okay. Was the same model or same modeling services being used in 14, 15, and 18?
I'm not 100% certain about all three, but I'm pretty sure about the primary model. It was the same service.
And did you all experience divergence then, or divergence of this magnitude?
I don't recall the exact amount. I know I'm pretty confident our load was higher than forecast, but I don't recall how much.
Okay. And what about you indicated there was some inaccuracy in the weather forecast. I think you said 2 degrees off in DEC and a degree off in DEP. How significant is that in terms of the way you're operating your system?
Yeah, so I'll give you a kind of a rule of thumb. Just roughly in DEC, The winter time, typically a degree is in the range of 300 megawatts.
Okay.
That's what we typically use as kind of a rule of thumb. DEP, it's about 200.
Okay. One of the numbers, I think that, I'm not sure who went through these numbers, but were you all able to call on demand response in DEP on the 24th?
We believe we've got 200 megawatts in each of the balancing authorities.
200 in
demand
each
response.
BA. Okay,
That's correct.
thank you.
That is following our general load reduction plan
Okay,
through the course of the event.
okay. All right, I want to talk a little bit about, you covered the outage tool and the problems that you all experience with the tool, but can you talk generally about how the circuits are categorized and sort of how the model works or how the tool works in terms of determining which circuits to
I'll
curtail.
take that, Chair Mitchell.
Go ahead.
We predefine the circuits that will be impacted by the load shed tool. Those are broken down by priority. Priority one are the circuits that we will impact first when we find ourselves in an event like this. And this is residential customers, small and medium commercial, and industrial customers. And we target about 50% regional load through that priority one list. Then we go to priority two, which is the large industrial and wholesale customers that are served by the distribution system. And we target about 30% of load there. The last priority that we would go to is priority three. This is hospitals, nursing homes, and other critical agencies that have standby generation capabilities. Also includes local state security agencies, communication centers, news media facilities deemed extremely critical to public health and safety.
Okay, so you've got those three classifications or those three categories of circuits, and then the tool just runs through those circuits. I mean, it decides which circuits go off.
So that's the priority list,
Mhm.
and then across our jurisdictions in both for DEC, it doesn't target a certain area within that. It's spread across all of that service territory.
Okay.
It's
Who can speak to how you handle the situation? I'm going to ask this last question, then I'm going to allow Commissioner Clodfelter to ask a question. But those customers who are in need of power for medical reasons, how do you address? How do you communicate with those customers, and how do you ensure that they're aware, they have situational awareness in a situation like this?
So we do have the medical alert program where we actually have flagged in our system. Customers notify us that they have a special need associated with a medical condition, and we capture that as part of their customer information. We use that to notify customers whenever we have impending weather events or expect challenges on our system. For the week prior to Christmas, starting on December 21st, we made notifications to those customers that have special medical needs because of the impending weather event being the wind, initially, but also, from the load shed event and what we had to do there. So we do notify them relative to the potential for outages. Our messaging encourages them to make alternate arrangements and to make sure that someone is checking on them or taking care of their needs. As you can imagine, we have medical alert customers basically on every circuit across our service territory because those medical needs aren't concentrated on one circuit or the other. So in terms of restoration, that's really driven by, in an event, what damage is done to that system. So the medical alert is the notification of customers. In terms of restoration, our local ops centers have those lists and they will try to get those customers back. but it's really dependent upon, situational specific issues in terms of trying to prioritize those because they're all across our system.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Commissioner Gladfelter,
If I may,
you
Chair
may.
Mitchell,
Go ahead.
just a point, you had asked in earlier when I was speaking, the time at which we stopped actually given the 30 to 60 minute and went to end of day for load shed customers. That was actually at 11:15, specific number. I told you around noon.
Okay, and that's in both BAs?
That is correct.
Okay.
And then also there was some discussion here about restoration of customers between wind event and load shed. Load shed restoration was those were by the 4 o'clock timeframe. The wind event customers that carried over, some of those did extend into the evening on Christmas Eve, but they were restored on Christmas Eve. I just wanted to make sure I didn't mislead you on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Gillespie, I want to shift to one question. I want to be sure it gets asked. I'm going to have to leave a little early. With respect to the instrumentation, frozen instrumentation that caused the derates at Dan River, Roxborough 3, and Mayo, had that equipment been identified as vulnerable after your winter planning exercises following the Texas outages? Was that equipment identified as vulnerabilities?
So that equipment was part of the cold weather protection program, and that equipment had functioning insulation and it had operating heat trace, and yet the weather was able to overcome those circuits. We have some evaluation work to go do to figure out why that happened on those particular pieces of instrumentation and didn't happen on others. So could the wind have been coming out of a different direction? We have to go back to the manufacturer's specifications to see if they're accurate. But the insulation and the heat trace that is installed on those instrumentation lines were rated for a temperature lower than what we experienced. We have some engineering work to go do on this.
So going into the event, you had anticipated and taken proper steps to winterize that equipment?
We had anticipated, had proper steps, and had validated that equipment was in operation and functioning properly
For the weather conditions
for the
that you
weather
had?
conditions.
That's great. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question.
Can you all talk some about the customer notification process? You've outlined in details for the steps that you went through, but what, looking back on this event, what worked well, what went wrong? What are we going to do about it going forward?
Definitely earlier notification or earlier recognition of the conditions allows us to get ahead of that in terms of making those customer notifications. In terms of the actual notifications, whenever an outage occurs, not associated with a load shed event, if my power were to go out at my residence because of a vegetation issue or a car impacts a power pole, there's an initial restoration time that is provided automatically if I subscribe to the notification process. And it gives me an estimated initial restoration time. That occurs automatically if there's an outage at my residence. That's what occurred initially whenever we did the load shed events. There was an initial time of restoration provided to those customers. The corrective action that we have already taken is to go develop a message that's customized to a load shed type event, and it can be implemented in a matter of minutes. So we'll build into our process in the event that we have a load shed event required again, then we would implement that direct to customer messaging And it would basically notify them, that customer individually, of the fact that we have initiated rotating outages.
Okay, so if you are a customer, though, that does not subscribe to the text message alerts or hasn't signed up for email communications with the company, how do you find out this information?
So for the customers, they have the options of either text message, phone, or email.
Okay,
If they don't sign up for those, then they will be reliant upon the other mass media channels that I described.
okay. All right, Mr. Holman, would you discuss briefly the NERC reliability standard EOP 1102 and whether the company's implemented this standard prior to the 12/24 event?
I can.
That's, okay,
That's probably a question I should answer.
okay,
So EOP 11-2, at the heart of 11-2, it looks at three things. It looks at inspection activities that are in your of equipment in your cold weather program, maintenance of the equipment in your cold weather program, and training of your personnel that do the inspection and maintenance activities. That procedure goes into effect in April, but it had an action that the activities associated with the procedure be completed in the fourth quarter of this year. And all of our activities were completed in the fourth quarter.
okay. So fourth quarter of 2022.
2020,
And so
2022. So they're
it's not
completed in
effect-
December.
Okay, I'm sorry, I spoke over you. So it goes, the way I understand your comments, the standard does not take effect until April 23.
It's effective in April of 2023.
Okay.
That's correct. But it also required us to have done those actions by December of 2022. And our actions were completed in December of 2022.
Okay. And what can you tell me about the current status of Project 2021-07? And that may be a Mr. Holman question. That's the reliability recommendations coming out of the joint inquiry conducted by the FERC and other agencies following the 2021 cold weather event in Texas.
Chairman, so if you don't mind, we have a subject matter expert who could probably answer that question. I believe, potentially, not to put him on.
And it may be, Ms. Bennett, that the standards are still under development. We just want to be updated on where that regulatory process is.
Sure. Daniel Bennett, counsel for Duke Energy. The standard was approved by NERC a couple of months ago. It was filed with FERC approximately 2 months ago, and we're just awaiting approval from FERC.
Okay.
We don't know whether they're going to issue a rulemaking or if they're going to have any revisions proposed, but the standard coming out of the URI recommendations was filed with FERC, and we're just waiting.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So there could be a rulemaking following the standard.
There could be, they can accept the standard as filed. The standard that was filed builds upon EOP 11-2. So the standard that has been filed for approval requires that you specifically understand the operational limitations of your equipment, that you specifically identify your critical components. And there's 2 different requirements depending on whether you have a new generating station or an existing generating station. So you have to look at both, and you need to operate your equipment in a way that you can ensure it will operate at certain temperatures that'll be determined by averaging the temperatures over a certain number of years. You have to be able to operate at those temperatures with those precipitation, with that wind level for a certain number of hours. So if it's a new plant, you need to be able to operate for 12 hours in those conditions. If it's an existing plant, you'll need to be able to operate within 1 hour. With those conditions. If it turns out that you can't for some reason, then there's a corrective action plan that'll be created. So you go back and, kind of similar to what Mr. Gillespie was talking about, you go back and figure out, why did the weatherization fail? What is it that we need to change so that we get this right the next time? So that's the standard that's currently sitting in front of FERC right now.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Bennett before she steps away from the microphone? Okay. All right, I've gotten through my list. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to see if there are questions. Commissioner Brown-Bland.
Good morning. So you would sort of hit on one of my questions. I was going to ask, I think Mr. Peeler was talking about why the demand, there was a statement made earlier that demand was growing faster than anticipated. And I think you're saying the demand forecast were off primarily due to the temperatures themselves and maybe not understanding load, customer behavior with respect to the load impacts.
Yeah, both of those things contribute. The temperature was off by a few degrees, so that makes a difference. And then the other is predicting the load behavior on a Saturday, Christmas Eve. In other words, understanding what industrial, commercial loads, other things are there. So I'd say it's a portion of it's weather and a portion of it is the load behavior.
And I expect built into modeling and forecasting is some sort of contingency around the fact that weather forecasts might be off a little bit. So a couple of degrees, 1 or 2 degrees is something that is still part of planning, correct?
Correct. As Mr. Holman said, operating reserve calculations consider some amount of load forecast error.
And so one question, so you said in DEC 2 degree difference typically was 300 megawatts?
Roughly, yes.
And in DEP?
Roughly
one-
200.
Okay. And so do you have any numbers or information on that would give some sort of averages or different numbers than the 300 and 200 when you're in severe cold weather, or is there a
Yes.
different number that would apply?
So we currently don't have a different operating reserve number for that, but I think that's one of the things we're talking about is, are there different, uncertainties that need to be considered as we go forward with when the model has less confidence? So that's in our after action to.
But that 300 and 200 number, there's not a some sort of already uniform or understood number that number goes to 400 if you're down under 10 degrees or any such thing.
Not currently.
Okay. So in the history of the company, there's never been a need to have rolling blackouts, and so the history of the company goes way back at a time when we were far less advanced than we are now. And I understand that we want to take the best use of all the advanced technology and the new modeling, and we're trying to be efficient, cost efficient, and otherwise efficient. But is there some sort of room there or indication? And I know you're studying, so you might bring some of these answers back to us later, but are we too reliant on models and maybe not using some of the older technologies that had served us well in the past?
Well, for load forecasting, certainly we used a lot of advanced modeling, but we also use reasonableness checks compared to history and human experience. So those are part of our process that we validate. Is this a realistic estimate?
Mm-hmm.
In this case, we felt like it was a realistic estimate based on, common sense, operating experience, and so forth. So that is part of our check. The other is that we use multiple models. So, we typically will have a half a dozen forecasts that we can look at to make sure there's not an outlier or divergent. But to your point, we don't just rely on, a blind calculation, right? There is operating experience and knowledge in the decision making.
And I understand that every storm and every kind of event has, probably hundreds of thousands of different little fact differentiators that lead to different outcomes. And so we all do the best, and I'm sure the company does with what they can. But we have had severe weather instances in North Carolina. Having lived in the South all my life, and then growing up and befriending a lot of folks from up north, they were surprised to find out that we had 10-degree temperatures and so forth. And all my life, not every year, but fairly frequently, we do dip down like that. So, does the company include in its preparation, contacting, the larger use customers, the commercial and industrials, to, especially coming up over like a holiday situation, to understand how much, what would be online. I'm saying 60 years ago, probably at Christmas, there wasn't a lot that was going to be open, and you could have counted on that or using power. Now we have, as you ask the customers to refrain and unplug all these little things that suck up energy, I'm sure larger companies have operations that continue over Christmas, that kind of thing. In working with your larger customers, do you do some legwork beyond like technical computer modeling to be able to better advise you what's going to be, how much power that larger institutional customers will be using?
We do have some knowledge of that, and particularly we have knowledge of, whether schools or government services, all those are factored into our calculation. We do not contact, every individual customer, but we do have knowledge of large customer loads, as well as significant things like school system closings or governmental closings or, holidays that are observed by different industries.
All right. And then with respect to generation and systems operations, were any of those, and again, this may be something you learned in your follow-ups and your root cause studies and so forth, but was anything about this situation and the energy that was actually available to us impacted by personnel issues, the fact that it was holiday time, vacations, or less experienced personnel due to recent exits from the company, or anything like that? Any reason, or is that, and if you don't know if that's a reason, is that something you'll be looking into?
So I'll take that question, Commissioner. So far, all of our evaluation of the operational events during the time period point directly to equipment problems. And in fact, I would say that personnel performance mitigated the equipment problems and allowed us to get those resources back in service very quickly. So it's not always the case. We're not perfect. We've made errors before, but in this time period, our operators performed admirably, and our technicians responded quickly. Our technical personnel were right there with them, arm in arm during the troubleshooting and repair of these stations, and that's why we were able to get them back in service so quickly.
I would also offer that from a control room standpoint, the ECCs and DCCs, whenever we go into or recognize a weather event, we actually increase our staffing in those facilities. And because of the wind event that occurred the day before and the ongoing restoration, we were actually at increased staffing in terms of personnel in those facilities.
And since you mentioned increased staffing, was that the same at the call-in centers? Were those people brought in?
Those we did call in additional staffing for the call centers. It was already increased again because of the weather event in the aggregate that we had experienced on the 23rd.
Right. I thought that was the case because due to a power outage, I had called in, and initially I called in a couple of times because I was trying to find out updates. Initially, I was on automated system, but eventually, through no action of mine that I knew about, my call went to a live person. So I inquired had she been called in. So I just had that idea that they probably had been. Thank you for that. So going back, you indicated there were walkthroughs and with regard to kind of weatherization of those instrumentations, Dan River, Mayo, Roxborough, that kind of thing. Would and I have no doubt, and I'm not questioning that the employees performed admirably, but I do know that, just in general, an experienced eye might catch something that someone else didn't. And so like, I was just making inquiry because we all know we're in the middle of the great transition from the point of view of workforce. But, would any ideas of anything like that would have affected, the walkthroughs and those kinds of things, that manual aspect of getting prepared?
So I appreciate the question. And in all of these, like you, I go into it, I'm a skeptic. So, we'll look harder at the actual work we did in the walkthroughs, how we took the instrument readings that we took to ensure the equipment was in service. But everything that we have today points to that was done adequately, it was done with proficiency, and it was done correctly.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Brown, Lane, just to
yes,
add a little
sure.
bit from the Energy Control Center perspective. I had the opportunity to be at the Energy Control Center in Charlotte in the run up to this event and across the peak. I was listening to and talking to the system operators in Raleigh. The folks making the decisions on that day, from what we know right now, are deliberate. They were disciplined. They were methodical in going through their processes and procedures. The people that I saw working and talked to were experienced operators and, subject to a continued evaluation, both internally and through the FERC and NERC inquiry. Our performers performed well in difficult situations, having to make in very challenging operating conditions.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're doing this, but and Chair Mitchell mentioned it already, but from the commission's point of view, I mean, we definitely extend our thanks for that, because we know it was also their holiday time too. And they were called on and it was crunch time. Go time is what they call it. So,
And we will take that messaging back to them. That will be very much appreciated.
all right. The reasons, again, we may find out more later, but the reasons for the failure of the power actually purchased, as it went on down the line from Ms. Bowman, I was hearing it was because the suppliers were facing similar weather challenges. But do you know anything more about the whys today? Any type of contractual issues come to play in that somehow we weren't, I know we had non-firm, but somehow we weren't lined up to receive more, or
No, there was
first line customer?
no contractual issues. It was simply the cutting of those schedules from PJM.
And on to the tool and the failure of the tool. Does the tool itself have a backup? Do we have or is that just when we know when the tool fails, there has to be manual processes?
The backup to the automated tool is to go to the manual load reduction and then restoration, and that's what we implemented.
Do we know, are we the first time users of this tool? Do we know if this tool has had problems in other locations?
The tool is used by other utilities. It's used in our different jurisdictions. The tool, based on my understanding of the design, it is unique to each jurisdiction based on the operating system that you use in each of those jurisdictions. Our outage management system, our distribution management systems. So that tool is customized to a degree for each one of those operating platforms that are used in each of the DCCs. So we use it across all of our jurisdictions, and it is used by other utilities. As far as other failures, that's the piece that we're working on right now as part of our cause evaluation. Have other utilities actually seen this type of failure? We have not had any reported thus far that in terms of our investigation, but we continue that investigation.
Do we think, our thinking today is that the failure of the tool was a software issue?
I would not,
As opposed
it's,
to,
we do believe it is associated with the design of the tool to specify software or the specific.
right, but weather conditions or the amount that it was being called on to do, we don't think those are the reasons, or?
I would say weather conditions, no. The quantity or volume that we were doing, I'm not in a position to say that wouldn't factor into it.
All right, thank you. Were there any issues that you can identify or discuss where there were issues in bringing folks back online, and especially with regard to those that were part of what we've separated out here as the storm versus the load shed? Were there ones that, issues related to the storm in bringing power back up? Was that an issue that suddenly a large number would be restored at once? Was that causing problems on the system?
I would say, obviously the higher the volume of the outages, the more work there is to be done. But we had adequate resources for all of the restoration work that we were doing. And for the customers that were out as a result of the wind, that was the physical work of going through and doing the repairs to the system, clearing vegetation, down power lines or broken cross arms to make sure that we got all of that work completed. And it was just the time that it took to work through that. Again, initially from the outage, from the wind event, approximately 300,000 customers were impacted. That was on the morning of the 23rd. By the evening of the 23rd, we had all but about 36 or 38,000 customers restored from the wind event. And that number is what carried over into Saturday when the load shed event occurred.
Are we thinking now, when we saw Texas happen, we were like, we don't ever want to be in anything like that or close to that. But are we thinking now that we're seeing in the southern part of our country where we don't expect a lot of deep freezes, we seem to be seeing more of these weather events, or at least it's back there in the back of my mind that we should be expecting them. And they may be, once every 5 years, every 10 years, every other year. We don't know yet, but we see them increasing. Is that making us think that our modeling and our forecasting and our reserves, all those kinds of things, do the assumptions need to be looked at freshly from the perspective of these winter issues?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think that, yes, we need to evaluate all those things. Any changing conditions, extremes we haven't seen before, changing resource mixes, the whole mix here, we need to consider as we move through changing the resource mix in particular, and we see colder weather in December in this case, we need to assure that we have resource adequacy. Our imports, should we continue to rely on the amount of imports? Those types of things are all fair game for making sure this, we don't find ourselves in a similar situation in the future. Include reserve margins, right? We need to evaluate that as well.
And as the experts, and you've got, a slew of them here and back home, have these happenings brought these sort of doubts or in any way kind of eroded your prior thinking?
No, I don't think it eroded prior thinking. I think it reinforces our prior thinking. That those are very important issues that we need to be prepared to address.
And so, from a cost perspective, it's a balance, but because if we don't expect to have it but once in a blue moon, but maybe the proper comparison there, we might have to look more north and see what the Midwest and the New England states have been experiencing, maybe to learn some of their lessons on cold weather, because it's not the thing that we've had to contend with. On the mass messaging and the emergency alert, I received emergency alert from my county, so that's one of those mass messages, and I think it mentioned the 15 to 30 minutes that there would be. I forgot its exact word, but I knew when I read it that meant power would be out temporarily or for a short time. But I read it to mean. I assumed it was a countywide alert, and so I read it to mean that our county. I didn't know anything. I hadn't had any other media on, and so I really hadn't paid attention. And having just had some power restored earlier, I wasn't thinking. I just read. I wasn't aware of what was happening in the rest of the state, so at least knew or believed that my county would be affected, and I read it to mean that all the county would be affected. But that wasn't the case. What? In other words, my power was not rolled. I didn't experience a rolling blackout, so that tells me not everybody did. Some people did. What was going on there? What were the factors that were making it different for some and others?
Okay. We had the priority system, the priorities 1, 2s, and 3s, and that has to do with customer criticality. We reserve those emergency facilities and services to the last ones we would touch. But with that established, then we basically use all the circuits across all of our service territory, all of those that are in priority 1, and we'll step through those. And our approach is to ensure that I will say one location, one county, one city, whatever, doesn't bear the burden. So it's spread out across our system. So from what I hear you describe, there were customers in your county that were impacted, but others were not. So that would be expected because we're trying to spread it out across our system.
And so when you do a mass messaging, and I think you kind of hit on this earlier, I mean, it's not targeted, but one of the results is that, at least in my case, then I was expecting an outage. So I was modifying my behavior, like, I don't want to start this or that before this outage. And the messaging didn't include a time period. Later in the day, I was at another location, and I'm hearing on the cable news, I finally heard something and said, well, this would have happened by 10:30, or I don't know if you recall that in the messaging, but I heard something about 10:30 it would have happened. So then I knew, okay, I'm beyond 10:30. It's probably not going to happen. Is there anything we can do about that to refine that, make it a little better? And is my kind of understanding of that correct?
We will definitely, just like in all the areas of our business, we're going back and reviewing what transpired, all the communications, and we'll be looking for improvements. I will say, though, that, based on the duration of the event, with the tool working properly, it doesn't go back to the same circuits and take them off again. It'll work through all of that priority 1 list before it would come back and start back on it. So the duration of the event drives, how many circuits are touched.
All right. And question on the wholesale customers, were they called upon to help with, demand response and those kinds of things? Were their customers called on? And was there communications back and forth with the wholesale customers?
Yes, there was through the course of this event.
And were there numbers you gave Chair Mitchell a number? I had that on my list, but you gave her a number of how much savings we think we got from customer response. Were the wholesale numbers included in your number?
Those, subject to check, I don't believe so. Our customer responses from our customers is about 200 megawatts in each jurisdiction.
Okay. And was there internal load reduction that was called upon? Internal to the company? When I look at your plan for load reduction and system restorations, I see that as an option, and I don't know how much that would save, but I'm just inquiring whether internal load reduction, meaning internal to the company, was that called upon?
Conservation, internal conservation.
Mhm.
We went through that, the general load reduction plan, and to the extent that we felt like the programs would help at that time of the evening, we used them.
And we did send out communications to employees asking them to curtail and conserve.
All right. And my last, just sort of wrap up questions, while you were going through this and living through it, did it occur to you that some particular regulation was an impediment to what you were trying to do? Or that you may have needed some temporary relief?
I'll
any
take a
regulation?
shot at this one, that one of the things we looked at, especially at the plants that have emissions requirements, would we ask for a variance on emissions requirements should we feel that the ability to deliver power to the grid took precedence? We never followed through on that, but we were prepared to if the condition had evolved.
All right. Thank you.
Right, Commissioner Duffley?
Thank you for coming in today. I have a few questions. Chair Mitchell asked most of my questions, but I have a few follow-ups. With respect to voltage reduction on the distribution circuits, was this load reduction implemented? And then two questions with respect to that. What amount of the load was reduced, and what was the percentage of the load reduction?
We did in Duke Energy Progress execute our automated voltage reduction plan. I do not have the amount. I can get that for you.
Thank you, but not in DEC.
No, we did not.
And then with respect to the under frequency load shedding, is this an automatic relay? And
It is.
can you talk about this automatic relay and any type of load shedding with respect to the under frequency?
I can't speak to the technical relay itself, but I can tell you about the intent of the program. So the objective here is when frequency is declining, the objective is to protect generators from that declining frequency, from catastrophic long-term issues. And so as the frequency continues to drop, you have under frequency load shedding relays that will activate to shed the load to protect the generators. Because if you don't, the generator will trip and it just cascades to the loss of the system. So everybody has all transmission operators are required to have under frequency load shed relays set across their system within NERC. So they're all acting in response to this central interconnection frequency number.
Agreed. And so can you talk me through the event? I mean, did you have the frequency go below 59.3?
We did not. We
Okay.
did not. And that drove the desire not to get there, drove the decisions to balance.
Okay, I looked through, as you know, the company has come in and reported after each cold weather event to try to learn best practices. And I pulled your presentation from, I guess it was in April of 2022. And a question that I still have with respect to your load forecasting, could you please provide to the commission for the last 3 winter peaks, how accurate were the company's weather forecasts 3 days before the peak, a day before the peak, and then how accurate was the company's load forecast um, 3 days before the peak, the day before the peak, and how accurate was the peak load forecast? If you could do the 3 prior events and this event and submit that to the commission, that would be appreciated. The second request for information with respect to this presentation is you discussed the mean absolute percent error, or MAPE. I'd like to know what the MAPE was for December 24th and 25th. And then if we could talk about the grid status legend, and if you could talk me through how long did it take both systems, DEC and then talk about DEP, to move from yellow to purple?
So over the course of the week, we moved, and I'm going to walk us through Monday, the 19th through 6 o'clock on the 23rd. We went from green to what we call internally yellow, hands off. And based on the reserves we were forecasting, the move to go to yellow hands off on that Friday was a conservative move. It was to make sure we were erring on that side of conservatism. And so and Chair Mitchell, you asked a question about this earlier, and I think I answered it more from the perspective of an operator versus what actually happened. So I'll try to answer it better this time. So as we were sitting there at 6 o'clock, 6 p.m. on the 23rd, we were projecting over 1,000 megawatts of reserve in each jurisdiction. And that's enough operating reserve to cover our largest unit and provide operating reserves to handle the uncertainties that you can encounter in real-time operations. And specifically, it was over 1,500 in DEC, and specifically it was over 1,100 in DEP. And DEP, up until about 4 in the morning, 2 to 4 in the morning, we were still maintaining enough operating reserves to cover our largest unit. And so that's when we moved from later in the evening, or actually in the early morning hours in DEP, we moved from yellow hands off into purple. So it was over just a few hours.
A few hours. Okay.
In the early morning hours in DEP. In DEC, we started off with 1,500 megawatts of reserves at 6 o'clock on Friday. And then as we moved into the evening of the 23rd, that dropped to 1,000. And then it dropped as midnight came. We had the derate at Dan River combined cycle. It dropped below 1,000 to closer to 900. And so at that point in time, we were moving from yellow to orange. And then when we got to the point that we'd lost between 2 and 4 of those other units in the capacity purchases, that's where we moved into purple. Am I answering your question, Commissioner?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
So for DEP, you stated that you went from yellow on Friday to purple over a few hours. We'll say 3 hours. And DEC, it was the same, but it began at midnight.
Right.
And then when you moved into yellow, according to your plan, it says plant personnel will be instructed if work activities are to be curtailed, and to prepare to curtail all non-essential loads, and this communication is the hands-off directive. So that was done, correct?
Yes, we went into yellow hands off.
Okay.
Yep.
And then you have different activities for grid status orange and red before you move into purple. Were all of the bullet points conducted by the company?
At this point in time, subject to check, I believe they were.
Okay. And then when you moved into grid status purple, it says that you can load shed by one of two actions: implement distribution feeder rotations through, I heard this, automatic system, or to implement emergency load reduction. And I just want to confirm which one of these was implemented, or was it a combination of both?
In DEC, it was entirely distribution rotating load shed. And that is more surgical in its usage. And it is intended to be used before you get to transmission load shedding. In DEP, we did it in two blocks. It was a block of 600 and then a block of 400. And when we were having problems with the tool, we did open two transmission lines to get the final 111 megawatts of load reduction that we needed to recover. That outage was very short, maybe 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And then according to your feeder rotation, it says the outage rotation may be part of grid status purple, and the interruption records will be kept. If you could provide those interruption records to the commission, please. And then also in 6.11.1.9, it says that that you provide a report of the shortages and anticipated shortages to FERC, and I assume that you've already done that. And if you could, we could probably have our own people provide that, but or obtain that. But if you could provide that to the commission as well.
Part of our reporting obligation in the run up to real-time operations are DOE reports.
Mm-hmm.
And we perform those. We actually had to perform those in the windstorm the day before because our customer outage criteria was above 50,000. So we have the history there.
Okay, thank you. And then I wanted to ask you a little bit about, in some of your previous responses to the commission, you discuss how you reach out to your neighbors through your CERC neighbors as well as VACAR. I heard your response that the energy wasn't there. So the VACAR, whether you were in it or not in it, the energy just wasn't there to flow. But how about our neighbors to the south, specifically Southern? Did you reach out and did you have these, let's see how you described it, hotline conference calls? Did you have these hotline conference calls with other members of CERC?
We were having constant communication with, from the balancing authority reliability perspective, we were talking to our neighbors. And Southern was also in various stages of EEA 1 and EEA 2. And I think, Nelson, you maybe want to speak to the purchase side of it, but there just was not anything to purchase.
Yeah, the purchase certainly looking for not the same, necessarily all the same folks, but anybody who could sell, whether they be a market or another utility, and there were none to sell during that time period.
Okay, and so I take it then the SEAM did not provide any
So
value?
SEAM, is a non-firm energy only on a 15-minute interval. And so essentially the members of SEAM were all in some form of EEA, so they weren't offering any sales.
Okay, thank you. And also in the last technical conference, we did talk about your resource adequacy. And as you know, you have 2,000 megawatts of non-firm imports that help with resource adequacy. Is the company going to be reevaluating that issue?
Yeah, I think that's previous response. We need to look at all of those assumptions as we go forward.
Okay, and then is it safe to assume that increased transfer capability between regions would not have assisted in this situation?
I think that's correct. There wasn't energy, so the transmission really wasn't the constraint.
And we talked about this briefly earlier, in terms of transmission loading relief, TLRs. There were none of those. All the alerts in the NERC process were energy emergency alert related. So that indicated to us and to me that it was an energy capacity shortage versus a transmission issue. And on the day before, TVA was also one of our neighbors, both in DP and DEC. They had entered EEA3 on Friday, the 23rd, and they were shedding load. And we were actually supplying emergency support on Friday for as long as we could out of DEC. And so throughout the day before, we were having these communications and there was just no energy to exchange.
Okay, thank you. And you may have already answered this question, but what was the forced outage rate at the peak for both systems?
The number we calculated was 10.6%, and we're validated. Those were the numbers. They're validated, they're checked, but they need to be audited. But between 10 and 11% was the max number
Okay.
for that's for all generation.
And do you feel there was adequate staffing? And thank you to all of the staff members that put in many hours to get the power back on as soon as possible. But from a company perspective, do you feel like there was adequate staffing for the event?
I do, and I really appreciate the recognition of our folks that were out in the field doing this work. But we went into this weather event with both staffing and staffing plans, call out lists and the like. And at least early on, through my personal monitoring of the restoration activities and the work that was going on, I've not found where we were held up in restoring generation because of a lack of manpower.
Thank you for that. And then again, this may have been asked and answered, but in previous times when you've responded to the commission regarding whether we're prepared for cold weather events, what you have prior to winter, each of the facilities are go through a checklist. And I heard you say today that each one of those facilities, the checklist was performed. Then you have a separate set of actions when there's a specific event impending. And so I just want to confirm that each item on that checklist for this event occurred. Did I hear that as well?
You did. So all our preparatory activities were complete. And I personally sit in and listen to the status updates of these as they're occurring. And then the ongoing plant monitoring through operator rounds and the like was performed throughout the event.
Okay, and then this is just a curiosity question. Bad Creek number 1, I saw that there was an outage maintenance. And so was that forced outage?
It's Bad Creek 3, our Bad Creek 3 unit was in the outage. And that is a planned outage. It's a power uprate outage.
Okay.
It's a power uprate outage. Uprate. It's going to generate more megawatts for the next set of cold weather.
Okay, so I'm looking, so I might have bad information, but I'm looking at the week of December 19th report. And on this, it says Bad Creek 1, 420 megawatts, had an outage maintenance. Is that incorrect?
I don't know if that's incorrect. On the 22nd, I think Bad Creek 1 was in service.
Yeah, so
But
I'm sorry, I'm not certain, but I think that that sheet you're looking
ended
at,
before the.
it was a brief outage, I believe, for a few hours or part of a day to do some maintenance. I believe we can follow up on that, but I believe that's what it is. And it was in service during the event.
Yeah, we ran 3 Bad Creek units throughout this. We moved a lot of water around between Kiowee, Jocassie, and Bad Creek.
Okay,
And-
and it's just, yeah, let me ask this one last question. Basically, I wanted to know if you discovered any forced outages when you were preparing for this storm? Or did you find any problems with the equipment
Okay.
leading up to before December 24th?
We did. We found things, insulation gaps that might be missing that we closed up. Yeah, I think I'll have to go back and look, but when we checked circuits, were they drawing enough amperage, and corrected those. But there are a few discrepancies that were found and corrected. Identification of, a space heater that may not have been operating correctly. But we work as we go through the process of or identifying these, we resolve the discrepancies as we find them.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't have any questions. I think Chair Mitchell has a follow-up.
I want to follow up on Bad Creek. So I heard you say you all had 3 units in service during this period of time. I'm specifically interested in the 24th. How was Bad Creek being utilized? How were you all operating it?
So Bad Creek, so we had plenty of water to use. And so what we were doing was we were using the hydro resources across the peaks. And then during the day, when load had come down off of the peaks, we would use that energy again to move the water back up from, in this case, Jocassie to the Bad Creek Reservoir. But essentially our hydro operators were using the power when it was available to reposition the water such that we could operate the units reliably at night and then through the peaks.
Would that have been happening on the 24th when you
It did
were,
happen on the 24th.
when you were shedding load at that? I mean, were you storing water
No,
while you were shedding
We were
load?
generating. We
Okay.
generated through the peaks
Okay.
and through the high load periods of time. And we were pumping in the valleys of the power profile when power was available.
And the pumping was in preparation for the peaks on the 25th and the 26th. We had run Bad Creek really hard in the evening before and the early morning hours. And the fact that we pumped did not have an impact on our ability to restore the customers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, that's all.
Yeah, I didn't.
Thank you. I just have a few things I want to make sure I connected the dots correctly. Related to the whole modeling issues and forecasting issues, do I understand from the sum total of all your presentations that if that had been more accurate, the impact would have been better and earlier communications, but it wouldn't necessarily have impacted a lot of the other repercussions of the storm. Is that, am I connecting the dots correctly?
I think that's fairly accurate. I mean, better, a perfect forecast a week ahead would certainly been helpful to prepare. But the fact of the matter is that there was limited energy available at those levels. We could have prepared better. We could have communicated better. But to say it would have eliminated the event would be I think would be a stretch.
And Commissioner Hughes, just for reference, on the 19th, on our daily analysis, and I think Mr. Peeler had referenced this, we were predicting a low temperature on the 24th of 17 degrees in DEC. The National Weather Service was the same number, 17. In DEP, we were predicting a temperature of 20 degrees across the peak on the 24th, and the National Weather Service was predicting 21. And in that scenario, we were in condition green in both jurisdictions, and that was Monday in the morning hours, the 19th.
Okay. And then another, just so I'm understanding sort of the progression of things, there was the is it fair to say automated rotational and then manual rotational disruptions? Is that, I'm looking at the sheet you gave and it says 8 o'clock AM rotational rotational outages ended. I think what this means is the automated rotational outages ended.
That's correct. As far as the additional load shed, for the initial 400 megawatts in DEC, the tool continued to work.
Okay, but then you did revert to these manual, much more, a high number, the fairly high number circuit number that you gave. Those were all occurring after 8 AM.
That is correct.
Okay. And then throughout the day, was there a period where the outages were continuing because they were being done manually? And if it had been automated, it would have stopped at 1 o'clock versus 4 o'clock? Man, did you keep track of that? Will we know that answer later if you don't know?
We can provide detailed outage data, but the load shed outages were ceased at 8 o'clock, around 8 o'clock. And so we were then back into the back into the restoration efforts.
Okay, I'm not sure. 8 o'clock PM.
8 AM.
Okay. So I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding. So were the manual was the resumption of power, but not
We actually conducted, when after the tool stopped responding, we initiated manual load reductions.
approximately what time was that?
That was
It says at 7:10 AM, the rotational load shedding tool failed to respond.
that is correct.
So I'm maybe misunderstood. So when did there was manual load shedding, was there not?
Yes, there was,
And when did that?
starting at 7:10 AM
Okay, and then when did that go to?
to approximately 8 o'clock.
Okay, so it was only, okay, and then from 8 o'clock on was manual,
Restoration activities.
okay, both some that might have started under the load shedding tool and some that started between 7 and 8. Okay,
That is correct.
got it. Got it.
Sorry if I was confused.
No. I just a lot of use of tools and there's a lot of things going on. Okay. Then some hopefully easier questions. First off, is it an opt-in or opt-out with customers to get these notifications? Does that, we have a lot of debate with behavioral, do you make things opt-in or opt-out? Do you know, is it opt-in or opt-out?
It's my understanding that you opt in, but I will validate that unless others.
The text message notification is opt-in.
Okay, and the phone messages opt-out?
It's opt-in as well.
Opt-
It's all opt-in, I do believe, but we'll verify.
Okay, and do you have percentages with your residential? What percentage are using each of these different communication?
I do not have that unless
We
you.
have that available, but we can provide it. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head.
Ballpark, is it 25, 50, 75%? Do you have any idea?
I really don't, I can't guess. I think it's less than 50% for the opt-in text. But we will verify that and file that.
Okay, and then I think you said then the phone calls and I guess the text too were a third party provider that did those. So, and they were using messages that were pre-written out messages. So the problem was you didn't have a message for this situation. Is that, did I understand that was the,
We have pre-programmed messages for outage events that go out that basically say it's your initial time of restoration. And it's between 3 and 6 hours based upon the condition and the jurisdiction. And that's an initial time of restoration. Then typically we would come back and provide an updated ETR after technicians, and we can investigate the individual outage and we know what it is. And so we'll have a follow-up message. In this event, because the outages were initiated and they were initiated as part of the load shed, there was for the first outages that occurred, they got the automated message that said their power would be restored between, like I said, it varies according to the location, but that their power would be restored in 6 hours. That is for a normal course of business, that ITR, that initial time of restoration. When we're using the rotational load shed tool, we set in that tool for the outages to be, our initial settings are for those outages to last 15 minutes. So we had customers that initially got a notification of 6 hours and their power came back on in 15 to 20 minutes because we were using the tool. What we have done since is we've developed a message that we would send out as the ITR if we enter into load shed again, and that can be turned on in a matter of a few minutes so that they would get a more accurate message relative to the rotational load shed vice the initial ITR that I would say is, typical, the typical standard message.
okay, and those,
That,
no, that makes sense. I think I just needed a clarification. And then all of that's only for opt-in. If you weren't opted in, then it didn't matter. You wouldn't have gotten any of these messages.
that's correct.
We haven't talked at all about how solar responded during the day. Now, obviously, a lot of your timeline it wasn't around, but it was as I recall, a bright sunny day in most of North Carolina that day. Just for relative scale. So we had the demand response at 200 megawatts. What kind of solar did you pick up during the morning hours? And was that helpful? And, just again, scale wise?
So I'll take that, Commissioner. Solar did begin to pick up in the morning hours as the sun comes up, and all the megawatts are helpful. So solar was helpful. Sam, was it on a few hundred megawatts early on as the morning progressed? But for the condition that we were in, the actual peak occurred prior to sunrise. So but it was there, and as soon as the sun came up, it responded, and the energy was utilized.
And Commissioner Hughes, on the 24th, that helped us. It supported our ability to start pumping at Bad Creek and Jocassee to get ready for the next day. That was after the sun had come up, after the load had bottomed out. That was helpful and supported our decision-making there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the general mass media interviews, there was a call out to solar that, we're going to, by 10 o'clock, solar is going to be online. And that's one of the things that's going to help us. So I guess that explains the thinking behind.
This is normal. This is normal. So, if you just look at our system, it's normal for the solar load to pick up, and then it's normal for us to use that to position water and the like so that we can be better prepared for when the sun's not shining.
It's certainly a known operational characteristic of our solar resource.
And I know we're operating at this very pesky early morning winter peak. But it does seem, is it true that even after that winter peak, there may have been periods of time following, 1 or 2 hours where it wasn't the peak, but solar was still contributing to reducing the amount that had to be shed, load shed? I mean, it doesn't, or was there,
It did not contribute in the time frame that we were making decisions on load shed. It was dark. It was in the 0400 to 0500 timeframe. There's no solar available at that point.
so the limitations on restoring power wasn't, it wasn't a available generation issue. It was just the logistics of returning power.
That is correct.
So in a perfect world, you could have flipped the switch at 8:30 or 9 o'clock a.m. and everybody could have had power. Not that I'm asking you to do that, but in a perfect world, just from as far as the numbers matching up load and generation, there was that match.
I don't know that, Scott, we're ever in a perfect world. I don't think.
Well, I just meant matching load and generation.
We started the process of restoration in that 0800 to 0900 timeframe.
And I think the simple thing would just be a chart to see what your generation capacity was versus what your load capacity and when they crossed. And I'm hearing you say that they crossed probably before daybreak, or 8:30 or 9.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then did the curtailments on the other end impact solar? We heard a lot in Texas about sort of the disconnection between, disconnecting potential sources of energy. And I'm just curious, was that in play at all here?
God, I'm not aware of.
What, would you repeat?
So, in other words, were there solar facilities that were disconnected in your rolling outages?
I'm not aware of any, but that's not my area of expertise. I think we would have to take that as a follow-up.
We can come back with the specific characteristics of solar, but from the conversations I had with our renewables VP, solar performed exactly as we expected, provided the energy that we expected, and provided it on the timeline we expected. So, and that is, it begins ramping up around that 0600, 0700 timeframe, and then gets more as the sun comes up, and then trails off just like it does every other day. We didn't have any. We just had no issues with our solar generation.
Okay. Last question. In this priority tier, you only got to priority 1. Is that correct? You didn't go into priority 2 or 3?
That is correct.
And then where do water facilities fit into the categorization? Are they a specific call out for category 3, or you had mentioned hospital, you had mentioned several priority 3.
Critical infrastructure,
Yeah.
those type of things would be in that category 3 or priority 3 in terms of, importance to our communities.
Okay, so in theory, you wouldn't have cut, if you knew that was there, you wouldn't have cut a water facility.
Not that I'm aware of. I can't tell you there's no exception out there, but just the priority list, those would remain, would be one of the last ones that we would impact.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you for that. And again, thank you for getting us through a very difficult time.
Commissioner McKissick?
First, let me thank you for being here today, and you've certainly been open and candid in your responses over the last 2 hours or so to all the questions that have been raised. I think your report has been certainly enlightening in terms of providing some context as to the factors that were taking place during this timeframe. If I were to sit here and listen and learn from it and think about what the takeaways are, when it comes to this notification system, we need to upgrade it as soon as possible so that any customer that has the potential for experiencing some type of load shedding impact, that be top priority in getting resolved.
Yes, sir.
Secondly, this modeling. I mean, we've learned that the model has not performed as it should, but it's a regressive, regression analysis type of model, and you didn't have the history. And the history was unprecedented because the event was unprecedented. But now that we have that data, let's use that data as carefully as we can to upgrade this model so that we can better predict what customer behavior is likely to be under these types of circumstances. One thing we all know is that the weather, and extreme weather, does not respect political boundaries, nor does it respect the boundaries and service areas of any utility. And that's what we faced on this particular occasion. Unprecedented circumstances and a response that was appropriate with the load shedding. Now, could it have been done more effectively? I think the answer is yes. Was it the solution to a problem that was unfolding rapidly? The answer is also yes. But I think that in my mind, what I want to do is look at the takeaways in terms of how we can improve things. I think Chair Mitchell and many of my colleagues have gotten to many of the technical details are critical, things that we must be focused upon. At the same time, the only thing customers want to know is that power is there when it's needed. They don't want to go through these types of load shedding circumstances and not understand first the purpose of it, and then secondly, what the duration might likely be when that power is interrupted. The thing I've heard most about from individuals, customers, they did not understand load shedding was about to take place. They didn't understand how long a load shedding event may take place and impact them. And they did not understand why it was even necessary. I think a lot of that is public education as well. And we need to be focused upon getting people to understand what that actually entails. You know, when it comes to this model, I wish that it had been better in terms of predicting behavior. If it had been, we would have not had to perhaps had as broad and an expansive impact as it has unfolded and occurred. But you know, that's water over the dam, so to speak. I think what I would like to do is make sure that we recognize the people that were out there in the field on Christmas Eve working, not just those sitting back analyzing the weather and analyzing and doing the modeling, but are actually restoring service due to high winds and extreme cold under extraordinarily adverse circumstances, who really deserve a great deal of credit for being out there under those circumstances. That's not something everybody would want to do. I always thought that firm commitment meant firm commitment when we entered into these kind of agreements, or when I say when Duke enters into agreements with people to provide power. Unfortunately, the firm commitments couldn't be honored because they were going through similar load shedding events. Why? Because the cold was expansive, because it was impacting everybody. And one thing we know, and one of the reasons we're working right now on the carbon plan, which is recently released, is to make sure we minimize the impact of climate change. But we can't sit here and look in a crystal ball with any definition and clarity and know when the next extreme cold event will occur. We had a winter storm Diego a few years back. We had the polar vortex and all that that entailed. And yes, we modeled behavior based upon that at that time. But you could enter into these firm commitment agreements. You could get the power in from somewhere else. It didn't work this time. It wasn't a viable option. So I say to you, let us work together constructively. Let us sit here and get the data in that needs to come before us. Let's do the critical analysis that must be done, because it's imperative to do so that we minimize impacts like this in the future, and we can better predict load, we can better predict behavior, we'll be better prepared. And yes, let's make sure that when winterization occurs for our critical infrastructure where our generating facilities are out there. Should we have had things derated? No. But it looks like it occurred for whatever the reason may have been. I think that's a deep dive that needs to be taken as well to find out why. Because it should have performed better than it did under the circumstances we experienced based upon the modeling and analysis that has been done in the past. With that said, there were certain circumstances that were brought to my attention anecdotally related to a solar provider over in Person County. And perhaps you can follow back up and get some detail to the commission and to us and work with that particular developer. But what was shared with me is that there was Person County Solar Park over at 75 Crown Boulevard in Timberlake, North Carolina, that they obviously provide power to Duke. But the project was turned off by opening the reclosers at 7 a.m. on December 23rd and turned back on December 24th at 7 p.m. with a loss of generation 2 prime days, full sun, that when DNP was, shorter service, shorter power, I should say. I'm not sure why it would have been turned off for 2 days when they had the capacity to provide power. It is my understanding there was a commercial entity that is right across the street from where this farm is located. And during that 2-day period, they only lost power for 2 hours on the 23rd. It's a little bit intuitively inconsistent to think that that power could have been provided and it was not utilized. And similarly, I guess there was a project, another one in Person County over to 157 Hunt Club Road, where it was somewhat similar. The project was turned off by DEP 5 a.m. on 12/23 and turned back on at 2 p.m. on 12/24. Loss of generation capacity there as well. Maybe there's some idiosyncrasies going on that we don't understand. But please get back and specifically related to those projects. There may be others out there that were similarly situated, but at a time where we can't even get firm commitments honored due to curtailments, we got power providers that are right there able to do so. Why we aren't capitalizing, using that power at a time where there's a critical shortage. On that note, I thank you for being here. I thank you for being candid. And I thank you for what I know will be constructive dialogue as we move forward in addressing these issues for the good of the ratepayers here in North Carolina, but more importantly, for all of those that use and consume service. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Kimbright, I'm going to give you a chance, but I want to check in with the court reporter. We have worked her pretty hard this morning. You doing okay? Okay, well, let's continue then. Commissioner Kimbright.
Basically everything has already been used. Did have one.
We will, and we do, and we actually on the evening or the afternoon of December 24th, we issued those conservation messages through all the channels that I talked about, asking for assistance on Christmas morning. And then also we issued those on the afternoon of December 25th, asking for the assistance on the morning of December 26th.
All right, with that, we have come to the end of the briefing. I want to thank you all again for being here and for answering our questions. If there is nothing further from any of my colleagues, we will be adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.